After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
Welcome back to the Greenhouse, dear listener. I'm glad to have a follow-up to episode 14 about piss. Today I'll be discussing The Establishment. Returning with us for the fourth appearance, please welcome back Tyler.
Hey, how's it going? You're not gonna explain the acronym for people who are catching this one and not the...
Yeah. So
I'm down. I'm down.
This series is about power, identity, and social structures, but piss just has more of a punch to it.
Cool.
And joining us for his first appearance, please welcome Josh.
Hello, thanks for having me here. I'm excited to participate in this discussion.
So I figured you two would be good for what we wanted to get into today, considering our experiences, working in a college Dems chapter and a couple campaigns. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this new framework that's emerged, I think, particularly since 2016, actually, where there is a clearer divide between party leaderships and the constituencies they command. And whether you talk about the Bernie faction within the Democratic Party, DSA members getting into the House, or on the opposite side of the aisle, you have more alt-right or more culture war signaling opponents that seem to make a show of allying with Trump. More and more people seem to commonly state they're opposed to an establishment, but that who or what the establishment is really up for grabs.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate. At least, and I think it's a different story on both sides of the aisle. For the Democrats, the establishment's been really entrenched as it is, in its current state. It's been really entrenched there for a long time. And I want to note that, the establishment can change over time. The current group that we would consider the establishment in the Democratic Party is kind of Clinton's third way, the New Dems, or I prefer to call them the Democratic Leadership Council, or DLC, which is a, better acronym since it's also associated with other things that people don't like. But this group has been in charge for the past 40 years almost. And they have kind of, and I think in both parties' cases, the establishment is really rooted in electoral politics. What does it take to win an election? And I think that's what motivates them. And that's very much the stated mission of the DLC. But I think Republicans are very much the same way, but we're seeing them kind of take on a new form in the past few years that I think is almost like a political chameleon and willing to adapt to their base, whereas we don't necessarily see that so much on the Democratic side.
Yeah, I wanted to look up a statistic real quick that kind of, I think, relates to this discussion. Because I think a lot of the times, like, when people hear establishment, they think that we're talking about, like, super educated, like, kind of centrist, like, people. But I think one thing to note when you get the difference between the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment, kind of like what Josh was saying, the Republican establishment is now hardcore. We love Trump. The election was fake. Whereas like 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. Like they considered themselves to be more like, I guess respectful maybe. I'm not, again, they kind of just embraced the right, like super alt-right as their new establishment. Like this is our party now. Whereas on the Democratic side, I looked up this poll. Granted, this is from December of 2018, so you're going to have to think about what the Democratic Party was like back in December of 2018. Where at that point, a poll conducted showed that 80% of registered voters supported the Green New Deal. And the Democratic Party did not even consider adopting the Green New Deal as kind of any part of their platform or anything. I mean, they've always kind of said like, oh, we love the environment and whatnot. But when you look at how the establishment kind of rejected that, so it is really curious to see how with the Republicans, they've been so gung-ho on embracing like the crazy stuff that a lot of their voters are pushing, whereas the Democrats have been like super resistant to the stuff that their voters are kind of pushing. So I get your point that they're into electoral politics, but I think a lot of the times it's like the establishment just kind of exists to slow down certain movements, but not all of them.
Well,
I don't know.
it's funny because I want to touch on what you got at earlier, because it leads into two interesting points. Is one, like when we were talking about the environmental policy that Democrats are adopting, and you said the establishment slowed it. It becomes useful, and I say this like not as a dismissive way. It is a useful shorthand to refer to a couple complex stories, right? You have now that Tom Perez is DNC chair, he rolled back the Obama era reform of not accepting fossil fuel contributions. So we can talk about that. We can talk about ties to the oil and natural gas industry. We can talk about certain votes that certain senators have made when it comes to energy and environmental policy. But it took me like a minute to say that, and using the shorthand, but the establishment pushed back. It's a useful framework to refer to all that, and yet it's obscuring in the process. And then the other thing too is like, from what you're saying, and at least at the time of this recording, there appears to be some kind of astroturfed, in my opinion, fight over whether Republicans should support Trump or not. It seems to me that, at least at a surface level, this establishment on the Republican side is more fractured.
Yeah, the way I see it is when the only like 3 or 4 elected Republican officials actually acknowledge that Joe Biden is supposed to be president, then to me that just tells me that the establishment of your party is now just crazy. They're now just not accepting reality. They are going out of their way to deny true factual statements and push this ridiculous agenda. I mean, I can probably count them on one hand. Like, it's Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, Suzanne Collins acknowledged.
No, I think it's Murkowski.
Lisa Murkowski. So Suzanne Collins hasn't even acknowledged that Biden's president.
I mean, I think most of them have acknowledged that they are, but have they acknowledged that he won the election?
But yeah, are they doing the acknowledgement, or are they doing the "How dare you, sir" posting? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and honestly, like, that's 4. I would be hard pressed to even come up with a 5th. So kind of to my point, like, they are the extremists now. They're the ones who are like off kilter from their party.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this too. I talked about when we were spearheading, a college Democratic chapter, and I'm thinking back when that happened. That was 4 years ago, and around 2016 election and whatnot. And I remember back then, Ted Cruz stood out as like a uniquely despisable figure, right? Across both sides of the aisle, people hated him. He was seen as beyond radical. But now he doesn't. There's very little that sets him apart from his colleagues. He's very much just kind of there, and he was very like considered anti-establishment, right? He ran against the Washington elite and whatnot, and it's kind of weird too, because you've always, I think, in the Republican Party there was always been more of a pushback to their establishment, at least in electoral politics, where the members will run, both for Congress and for the presidency, running against Washington as a whole, including their own party. It'll remain to be seen whether or not that stays true in the next cycle, but it's kind of this very interesting change that's occurred.
That's a really good example, actually, because it wasn't that like the whole reason Trump said he deserved to be president during like their entire primary.
Yeah, well, and also too, it's kind of interesting as well, because if we compare 2016 with 2020, where the main difference in the Democratic Party, right, is that they're willing to coalesce against the insurgent candidate Bernie Sanders, whereas that wasn't true for the Republicans. And I think that there's a lot that's kind of difference too with the way that the establishment works in both parties. But I think, especially in the Democratic Party, it's very clear that it's very hierarchical. That it's very much you wait your turn, and Joe Biden gets to go first, and maybe in 50 years, Pete Buttigieg, you'll get a turn.
Yeah, growing up, when I was it was back during the 2016 election, I realized there was such a difference between the Republican and the Democratic Party. And it's all over the whole superdelegate thing. Like, the fact that in the Republican Party, the psycho party, people have more control over who the presidential candidate is than in the Democratic Party, where they can just say, oh, the superdelegates completely wiped out who the people supported. Like, That's crazy. I feel like a lot of people just don't understand that difference between the two of them, and then they wonder why the Republicans have gone so far in one direction. I think whether or not, I'm sure there's people who can make arguments against this statement. I would say that people who get involved in party politics typically do not want to meet in the middle. They are not the type of people who want to push centrist figures. They are the type of people who want to go super far in one direction, right or left. And since in the Republican Party, the people have such tight control over who their candidates are, they just got pushed super far to the right because that's what the voters, like, they wanted a very partisan, like very heavy, one-way issued person. Whereas in the Democratic Party, because they've got the things like the superdelegates and the couple of different structural differences in how their elections work, they're able to pretty much guarantee that someone that kind of the people who run the party think is the best candidate, not necessarily the people who are voting in the primary think is the best candidate.
Yeah, I kind of want to push back just slightly on that, in the sense that it really wasn't until more recently, though, that we were seeing the Republican Party kind of lose control over the selection process.
Okay.
They didn't have the super delegates to like literally kind of ensure that they could control who their candidates were, but we weren't necessarily seeing their radical members rise. And they did push back at one point, but I think it's just clear that that's kind of not acceptable anymore. But it's interesting. There's a book that I've been reading called Red State Blues that kind of talks about Republicans at the state level and how, and we can kind of go back to this a little bit later, but it talks about how they focus so much on like the social policies and whatnot that it's really kind of undermine their own agenda. Even when they're able to control all these state governments, they aren't really able to reduce the scope of government like they promised to. So because they're focusing all their effort on these other issues that maybe aren't exactly what their voters want, or maybe they are.
I think that's a useful avenue to discuss this, is how the culture war has really like become the avenue both parties seem to argue on. But to Tyler's point, actually, this is something I was thinking that came up as you guys were talking, is this adherence to norms. And I think 2016 is probably the turning point where, if you want to look at Trump's election this way, it was a rejection of a certain kind of norms. I still think that there's a lot of Republican types who observe them, like Mitch McConnell and others. But basically, having a figurehead who's more vulgar was not a death sentence the way people expected it to be. And we've kind of seen Republicans accept that to some extent, that like, okay, we don't have to. I mean, they were definitely more, or I would say less observant of the norms prior to this, but I think they're fully willing to drop the pretense now. And with Democrats, we're seeing a recalcitration of that phenomenon, actually, where the norms themselves are a kind of virtue and adhering to them is the thing. And it makes me wonder, like, you're right that the goal of certain leadership groups like the DLC is to promote a certain kind of electoral strategy, but it's one that I think is being kneecapped by their observance to norms. So I think that's what's probably characterizing this establishment versus the other, is one is saying, okay, we don't need to observe norms for success, and the other one is just caught up with observing them.
I have a question, actually, for you. Then. I'm curious. Do you consider Joe Manchin part of the establishment? Because his kind of, and I guess the reason that I think he fits your question here is that and then also Kristen Sinema, their kind of obsession with the idea of keeping the norm of the filibuster is preventing the Democratic establishment, which is unified on a significant number of issues when it comes to the Senate. It's preventing them from getting anything done. So would you say that they both hold like decently conservative opinions? I would say in certain regards. Right. But would you say that they are establishment because they are creating that roadblock? Or...
So my take is a little cynical, but if I'm being honest, I think in the sense of providing the administration cover for inaction, you could consider them the establishment in that sense, for sure, because you have constituencies that are pushing for action in a certain direction, And whether or not you believe Manchin and Cinema believe what they do, I don't think they do, to be honest. I think they provide a lot of cover for inaction, and then it gives Biden plausible deniability and say, look, it's not, I'm not doing this, or I'm not able to get this done, not because I hate you guys, but, you know, Manchin and Cinema are really busting my balls. And
Okay, that is a whole other conversation that I would love to get into. But yeah, um, the whole concept of people who claim that they're centrist, people who claim they're establishment. Like, I've been trying to not use the term centrist to refer to certain people like Manchin, like Cinema, because at the end of the day, I have no way of guaranteeing that you haven't just been paid to have these opinions. Like, I have no way of knowing that you're just you say you're a centrist because that's what your donors want you to say, and then you just don't act like a centrist. I mean, again, when 80% of registered voters hold a certain opinion and then you guys don't take that opinion, you're not a centrist anymore. You have placed yourself in a direction opposing this position because that's what your donors wanted you to do. But yeah, sorry, that's a whole side tangent that I'm sure could be a podcast in and of itself.
yeah, well, we can get into your previous question. Josh, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah,
That
I
you
was
posed?
gonna say I think to an extent it might be unfair to describe the establishment as a monolith.
Mm-hmm.
They're not all like it's not a hive mind, as much as it might seem to be. Because I think it's clear that there is quite a bit of selfishness among different members. I think probably a lot of them. As I said, I think fundamentally they're concerned about elections and winning elections. Whether or not policy outcomes match those results is kind of maybe that's less important to them. But I think I think a lot of people who are maybe they don't wholeheartedly support some of these issues. I think they would still want the electoral benefits of, hey, look, I passed Medicare for all, increased minimum wage, you name the issue. And they're probably frustrated that their whole party is going to be painted by a certain brush because of people like Manchin and Cinema. And it's kind of weird too because even if you look at like the individual members of Congress, it struck me that at the end of this congressional term, Pelosi will have been the top Democrat in the House for 20 years. And like that's a stability that like the Democratic Party has that is just not there on the Republican side. And McConnell's been there for a while, but not necessarily in the same spotlight. And in the House, the Republicans, I mean, that's been a turbulent mess for the past 5 years.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that with Pelosi and stability. I'm curious then, in your opinion, and please tell me if this is way too off topic. Why does it seem then, if the Democrats have had such stability and like their leadership is very cemented, why does it seem like Democrats have not really not been able to get anything done over, like you say, 20 years? Like, it doesn't feel like a ton.
Well, I mean, maybe the stability speaks to that, right? I mean, that's maybe a cynical take, but maybe it is that she's been there for 20 years and that's limited certain things. I've heard from congressional staffers that have said that like their bosses will tell them like, look, we can't afford to pass everything. This is like back in like '09 when Dems had the super majority, but we can't afford to like do all this because what are we going to campaign on? Right? Like if we solved every issue, what's there to campaign on? Which I mean, it's kind of this bizarre framework to think of, but it's fundamentally it fuels this thing where it's almost like these policy issues are props. They're not necessarily genuine interests. They're just there as a tool for campaigns.
That's an interesting way to look at it because it was going to lead into my next question: is do you think there's been a real trauma for this group in the Democratic Party since Reagan took over? That the literal trauma of losing an election that badly has kind of like reshaped their id and ego.
Well, it's not even just like Reagan. You can kind of take this back to, I mean, it was Reagan and Bush. That was 12 years of Republican control. But before that, there was only 4 years of a Democrat in office. And you had Nixon and Ford for 8 years before that. So Democrats were doing really poorly. And it's, so it's like to an extent, I can understand where, the DLC was coming from back when, they were trying to, retake the White House with Bill Clinton. But at the same time, it's kind of weird where it's, you kind of wonder if we live in a timeline where just serendipity got Clinton into the White House, right? You had Ross Perot in the election, you had the economy kind of collapsing under Bush. Was it kind of a fluke that he got in, and the Democrats were like, well, hey, this is how we win elections?
That's interesting.
I buy that theory. I really buy that theory, actually.
We had another 8 years after that with Bush Jr. But then we have 8 years of Obama. And the thing about Obama that kind of Obama strikes me as one of those people who ran on being very fairly progressive. Like, he ran on a lot of progressive issues. But then when he got in, he, it's kind of hard to dissect the whole presidency, but I would say that he didn't necessarily push a lot of these things as much as he claimed he would when he was running for election. So really, Obama kind of broke that mold, didn't he? Or am I wrong?
Well, I think he just made the new mold, because here's the thing. If you look at 2016 as a follow-up, right? Or no, sorry, 2020 as a follow-up, right? How many of the really like lower ticket male Democratic candidates, how many of them tried to channel and emulate Obama? You
don't even have to necessarily look at the lower ticket. Just look at the primary, right?
I mean, Buttigieg was trying to be gay Obama. You know what I mean?
But I mean, like they were all trying to emulate him in a different way, and even like Sanders, right, has like an ad where Obama's giving him credit for something. Right?
Oh yeah.
It's that important to have his approval.
True.
And it's interesting too, and this kind of speaks to something else where I think we've been talking about the establishment, and we probably still will talk about them as this kind of instrument or like an obstacle to progress. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that people support them, and not just like kind of out of like ignorance. I mean, it's rooted in this weird sense of like personality. Where they see them as like their favorite TV show character, and they're interested in seeing what happens with them. You look at RBG and her legacy, and not to take anything away from her. I mean, she did accomplish a lot of tremendous things, but like that decision not to retire is one that is like deeply divisive among people, where a lot of her defenders on there are like, well, she doesn't owe you anything, and it's like, well, she's a public servant. I mean, she does owe me something.
Yeah.
But it's just that framework is used a lot to talk about a lot of politicians, and it's just this weird backwards system of thinking about it, in my opinion.
Yeah, because it centers individuals as like heroes in a struggle, basically, right? And I think, like, speaking to like the fallout of RBG's passing and like the kind of things that were said in defense of her decision not to retire, I recall like probably one of the most harebrained ones being that she had to show Kagan and Sotomayor how to be in the Supreme Court. And it's like, weren't they highly accomplished lawyers and judges in their own right? Wasn't Kagan the dean of Harvard Law School? Like, yeah, she wasn't like some floozy who got in on luck. I'm pretty sure she would have been okay. But you would only believe that if you were trying to project some degree of affectation for this person. And again, if not me being cynical about it again, but it's like, but if you feel represented, you would come up with these defenses.
Well, and admittedly, I'm not super educated on the RBG situation specifically, but I will say it is also interesting to note you have that effect of like establishment Democrats kind of being painted as these like heroes in a struggle. From what I have seen from the different discourse and the ads when it comes to a progressive challenger, is that progressives are typically painted in incredibly negative lights. And I would say that continues even after they win. Specifically, I'm thinking about, Cori Bush. Cori Bush ran against an established Democrat, and she was painted as like rude, crass. I mean, there's a bunch of different like trash that was thrown at her, but then she ends up creating like the most turnout that had ever been a Democratic primary in that district, and she ended up beating the guy because regardless of what was painted in terms of like the national picture, she was able to get the people in her district out there. Another example I would say is like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, the district attorney race. It was the same thing where you had a guy. Now, granted, Krasner was the incumbent in that situation, but he had all this stuff like, oh, he's soft on crime. Oh, he's made Philadelphia so bad. Where it almost feels like kind of as an opposite, where you've got these establishment people when they're up against Republicans or up against what have you, they're really good at building this conversation around like, oh, they're a struggling person who's like pushing so hard. Whereas with progressives, it's like, oh, they're just crazy, or like, oh, they're attacking
pie in the sky fantasies.
Yeah, and it kind of made the thing that too, is you mentioned that even some incumbents. I mean, the Markey race in Massachusetts. I remember Pelosi came out to endorse Kennedy, not for any like policy reasons, but because Markey dare like insult, quote unquote, the legacy of JFK by saying, ask what government can do for you. So it's like a very personality-focused defense of the challenger.
And also, like, this is a first-time thing for her, but also I think in the House, right? That, like, a speaker endorsing a candidate in a primary race like that.
I don't know that it's necessarily... It was unusual because, like, everyone, like, all of the other leaders, I mean, mostly the Senate ones had already endorsed Markey, so it was kind of weird having that divide that usually doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, what I think you could probably do a whole case study about the Markey, and I'm sure there are people in college right now doing case studies of the Markey versus Kennedy primary, because it was basically like a script that was kind of flipped, where you had an older person who's tends to lean progressive instead of like conservative, who was being challenged by a young up-and-coming person who wanted to bring everything more.
Okay, but is up-and-coming like a third scion of the Kennedy family? Really, guys? Like...
Sure. But basically, that's kind of the point I'm illustrating, is like if you compare that to the Ocasio-Cortez versus Crowley race,
right,
it was the exact opposite, where you had an older centrist who was then taken out by a younger progressive. And it's just so interesting to see how the establishment, I would argue, tried to take that script and like use that script, and he was using a lot of talking points that a lot of younger progressives do. So it's very, very interesting to see how that played out.
This is probably going to lead back into the social issues point that Josh brought up earlier, because I think I want to start talking about how the culture war has injected itself into this discussion about the establishment, right? And the Markey race is a good example of this. Now, unless BIPOC means Boston Irish, police office commissioner, Ed Markey and Joe Kennedy are kind of a similar background. You know what I mean? Established politicians, have a certain amount of wealth, are from Massachusetts. You can guess the demographic stories there, right?
Well, and even, I mean, it should be noted, until more recently, I mean, their politics were probably almost identical.
Right. but that's what I'm getting at, is like when Kennedy launches his challenge, he's like, he's just another old white guy, and it's like, buddy, look who's talking. Like, and I'm seeing
that is gonna be you very soon. Like, you will also become an old white man.
Yeah, age comes for us all, buddy. But like, it seems to me that the co-optation of the language of the challenging constituencies is happening on either side, whether it's more establishment Republicans leaning into Trumpism or right-wing culture war language. I think now there is I hate using this kind of terminology, but it is a contest of wokeness among either side of the conflict in the Democratic Party. And it literally came down to, could Kennedy out woke Markey? Well, it didn't work, but the fact that he tried shows that they're really trying to like they're basically trying to insert themselves into this. Like they've accepted that this kind of co-optation of radical or academic language is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's going to happen in the discourse. We're not even going to push back on it. You had Clinton try to push back in 2016 where I forget what it was, where she said something and she kind of just shrugged it. over some kind of perceived bigoted statement. I can't
The
pull
Super
that up.
Predators
Yeah,
comment?
I don't remember the exact statement, but yeah, she
But
did try
something
to.
like that happened. Um,
Was it the Super Predators comment?
No,
I
that
think
was that was way back in the
that was
90s.
way back in the day.
Oh, okay.
But
It was
she
the
said
current
something
comment.
that could be
Okay,
construed as bigoted, and she just shrugged it off. That's the only time I've seen people like push back on this kind of thing. But I think we're seeing a full on co-optation of it. I mean, even I argue that Biden killed Me Too, right? But if you look at when he had to address his allegations of sexual misconduct, right?
Yep.
He literally said, in like trying to appeal to all constituencies in this fight, he said, "Well, if you believe Tara Reid, you shouldn't vote for me," covering all bases to look like he's met everyone who would say you didn't use enough of this language. And I think that the Markey race, right, where ultimately Markey aligns himself with the Green New Deal and Kennedy needs to oppose it, but then he's found a way. He's found a way to do it where he's like, actually, it doesn't include people of color, so we can't do it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's interesting though because in some ways, and you mentioned Biden, and it's like in some ways I feel like Biden has demonstrated the ineffectiveness of like the wokeness strategy as a
I
whole.
agree.
Because there's just so much about him that is like, I mean, I kind of joked and called him like Diet Trump when it came to like his personality and whatnot, where there's certain things that he would say. I mean, particularly about black constituents where they're not very diverse thinkers. If you're not
He
black,
said that.
yeah. What was the exact terminology? But like if you don't vote for me, you're not black. Like
Right.
certain things where like it's just like these guffaws that we would massacre other people for saying.
Yeah,
right.
Any other person said it,
but because of the crisis of needing to defeat Trump, we were asked to give him a pass.
And part of it too is like I wonder if it demonstrates because you look at his support among black constituents, and it's kind of it raises questions whether or not who is like the woke stuff really for? Is it for the minorities that we think that we're protecting or whatnot, or is it for kind of white people who feel guilty?
I would argue the latter.
Yeah, and I think one of the big differences, and I'm gonna just refer to some progressive campaigns, and I think the way that progressive candidates handle race in a lot of like better ways than I would say than establishment candidates is that you look at candidates like Cori Bush. If you can't tell, I really like Cori Bush. She actually like went out of her way to engage with communities of color and like understand what actually was happening to them. I mean, it helped that she herself was a woman of color, so I had a base level understanding. But she actually like instead of just using a lot of the language, she had like very specific, like, we are going to help address this and address this that is affecting you guys personally, which is why she was ultimately able to beat Lacey Clay, who he himself was a black man, but he kind of had been absorbed into the whole establishment thing and was kind of just doing what the establishment and what the party would be directing him to do. Plus, there was also like the corruption stuff. I mean, every election's different. So I'm not going to say that that's a perfect thing to apply, but I will say that by and large, when it comes to race, progressive candidates take a lot more of a actually communicating with these communities, with communities of color kind of approach, whereas established candidates focus on the lip service.
Wearing the kente cloth in the Capitol.
I think, to some extent, I think it kind of, it's sort of necessitated for progressive candidates to do this, because if they hope to like beat an incumbent, well, they have to seem more appealing than them, so they have to go, to the base and make their case.
Well,
which maybe makes a case for like how the fact that for the most part, it's like when we think of at least the Democratic establishment, we primarily think of older folks, Pelosi, Leahy, even like I'm thinking like Leahy, Feinstein, like all these like politicians who people are like kind of begging to retire, but are planning on running anyways, for another 6-year term.
Well, and I think this might touch on like the time that we're living in, but I noticed that the establishment, and you kind of referenced how the current DLC has been in for decades, they're kind of in a framework where, okay, we know that these demographics vote consistently, and we are not going to try to change or engage any other demographics because we don't think that's going to win us an election. Whereas a progressive will look at a community and be like, okay, these demographics don't vote. I'm going to talk with them, engage with them, and get them to vote. And that's how I'm going to win, is by engaging these groups. So it's just very interesting to see how that plays out. And I don't know if that's because of the time, like, history of communities of color being kind of disenfranchised, discriminated against, and encouraged not to vote. But I'm hoping that the progressive growth will kind of lead to a turnaround of that, where we've got a lot more communities getting out to vote that previously didn't.
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe more optimistically. I mean, I do think we'll see like an establishment shift in the Democratic Party. I mean, to be fair, like, the current establishment, I mean, they took the reins from the New Deal coalition, because they painted them as out of touch and whatnot. And maybe in some ways they were, with the times. There's certain things that I think they had kind of fallen behind on, but I think one way or another we're going to see a shift, in part because looking at the current makeup of the DLC and whatnot, they will be dying soon. Not to be that pessimistic, but it's like it's, the fact of the matter is they're quite old, and it's weird too. In some ways, Biden kind of marks the beginning of a new era in a lot of weird ways, even though he is very much an establishment candidate and whatnot, because his presidency is, if you look at every real metric, ratings and all that stuff, he has really kind of driven political salience down and has kind of taken that, personality out of it. And, it's like a lot of people are like talking about how his inauguration speech marked like the end of an era for a number of different reasons. He actually called out trickle down economics and whatnot, but in some ways it was like for the first time in 40 years, the president is boring.
The spectacle of politics is ending.
Yeah. Yep. Huh. Yeah. That's really.
I mean, that makes sense, because if you want to look at it as Biden ending an era, and assuming he views things in a rational sense the way I do, right? You would imagine he sees himself as a kind of transitional figure, and his job is to hand over the reins to whoever is going to head this next establishment. Now, he could just as easily be convinced that him, Pelosi, and Feinstein, and etc. will, continue to live forever. That's going to lead to some interesting ideas, but
well, I think you see they have an interest, and maybe the people that they're trying to breed for command, so as it were, aren't necessarily the people that we would want. But I mean, you can see where there is some efforts where they did shut down O'Rourke and Buttigieg's candidacies, but you can tell that they do see them as kind of like these are our successors in some way.
Yeah, these are pawns we're going to store for the next conflict.
In a weird way, these are the Gen X establishment.
Yeah, the Gen X establishment is going to take over next before.
Yeah, because we always forget. I feel like the conversation is always about boomers and millennials. We always kind of forget the Gen X is like nestled right in the middle there.
To be fair, they did a lot for us to make us want to forget them. But at the same time, like, it's good you bring that up, because this leads into the next question I had is, so my main interest in this, right, is we have the quote unquote squad. You can argue whether it's a coherent group or not. I know it's a media invention, but we're starting to see more openly left-wing candidates jump in. And in my estimation, I think if there's any confusion on why they're not able to match, I mean, first of all, a single representative can't do a lot in a, already complicated legislative, right? But we've kind of seen, or at least people, on my side of this have seen them slowly back away from certain radical positions or certain approaches to results, and have kind of adopted the same concerns of we have to kind of win elections before we do anything that we argue that the DLC does, right? And that's my, I guess, question is, do you think the establishment is able to co-opt figures like AOC, like Ilhan Omar, like Rashida Tlaib, or at least like keep them quiet to a point that they don't tear open the contradictions? Or conversely,
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Can you provide a specific example? Because I don't know if I have really felt a lot of that in terms of the Justice Democrats specifically. Because to me, the element that's kind of missing with the Justice Democrats is that regardless of whatever opinions or whatever they say, none of them take campaign contributions.
Well, taking campaign contributions is one thing, right? But I'm more so going at...
Well, they take campaign you're talking about from like...
Sorry, they don't take like corporate or like
yeah. And that's the thing. They've been pretty stalwart on campaign finance in that sense. So I have no criticism on that part. I'm more so talking about... I think there was a recent...
I think it might have been tied to the migrant child.
That's what I was getting at.
Issue, where they kind of, and I wouldn't say they were fully retreated, but they did take a kind of that more nuanced approach to the issue that is not necessarily appreciated, because again, it's like, when Trump is, or a Republican is president, it's like, oh, this is a human, it's a war crime almost. But with Biden, like, oh well, it's a complicated political issue and it's difficult to solve, and that is probably true, but there's also just not necessarily like it is disappointing to see them kind of retreat from that more harsh position. But at the same time, I mean, it is difficult when if we think about the squad specifically. I mean, that's what, 5 members is who we consider that to be.
It's anybody. I've gathered that the squad consists of anybody who's in the Justice Democrats organization.
Okay. Which
consists of Jamal Bowman, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, Marie Newman from Illinois. I think there's 7. I can't.
Okay. Well, either way, not a very small.
Raul Goravilla, Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal. Like there's a bunch. There's like 7 that have won elections in the past 2 cycles, but then there were like another 7 who were like sitting House reps who joined the org.
Okay. But either way, it's like it's a small slice of the legislature, and and we've seen, and to be fair, that can be powerful, right? We've seen in the Senate where frankly, 1 is a pretty large, or in this case 2, if Manchin and Sinema, that's a pretty large number, because it's enough to derail your agenda because of just the fragility of our coalitions. But I think they've been in a situation, and I think that to some extent, like, what Democratic legislation is worthwhile for them to derail.
Yeah.
At the expense of making a point and trying to force an issue.
Yeah.
Because
they are kind of one that comes up is the Pelosi vote.
I mean, that's really what the force the vote drama was about, right? Is that can you at least, now that the threat of Trump is distant, can we start to assert ourselves just a little bit?
Force the vote was a weird moment.
It was a very weird moment. I agree.
Because Trump was still president, and the whole idea was to force the vote on the Medicare for all.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I think I feel like it was orchestrated by people who just fundamentally don't understand the legislative process. And I don't know what goals they were trying to get. I mean, I think they had to know that this wouldn't actually get it to pass. I would think. Yeah. And was it worth, like, I feel like it hurt everyone involved, both the people they wanted to vote, because I get they wanted to like make that clear line of demarcation, but there really wasn't a benefit to doing it then, in my opinion.
See, and here's kind of my thing with the force the vote moment, and then really you and I have talked about the whole thing, like activism versus elections, right? Here's kind of my thought when it comes to progressives who are currently sitting politicians, right? Is that whether we like it or not, they are very much a minority. And they do have to just keep pushing. And they consistently keep pushing. Like, they never back down from 15 minimum wage, even that after that got killed. They have not backed down on any of these issues. They've still... they voted on stuff that maybe is kind of like diet versions of what they've been pushing, but they still keep repeating, like, this is the first step. We are still pushing for 15 or whatever. And I think really what behooves progressives at the moment, at least in terms of like the House reps and whatnot, is being a part of organizations like Justice Dems that are pushing to just replace these roadblocks. Like, again, elections... There's a place for activism, but I don't know if that necessarily needs to be in the elected House reps, especially because they have, looking at the squad specifically, they have been outspoken activists as well. Like, I'm thinking Rashida Tlaib stopping Biden on the tarmac. I'm thinking Ilhan Omar, even though she's had, more death threats than I think any person should ever have to deal with in their life. They keep pushing these issues, and they haven't backed down or really gone lukewarm on, I'd say, a vast majority. I think ultimately what they are attempting to do, and if it seems like they're focusing a bit more on elections, I think it just kind of stems from that fact that we are still in the minority. And ultimately, the only way we're going to get our shit through is through replacing these roadblocks, through elections, getting people through without compromising what our actual positions are. So I guess my larger point is, when it comes to the current progressives, I'd say that they are doing the best that they can with what they have.
I get that, and I do believe that, but I think the bitter taste that's in everyone's mouth after Force the Vote, I think is, there's a discussion about strategy that's happening, and a lot of these people having that discussion, like me, are idiots who don't know about the legislative process. That's correct. I buy that. But what it's kind of exposing, and maybe I'm reading this incorrectly, and you guys can push back, but it kind of conveys that either there is a fear of the establishment that prevents them from taking a kind of action, or it could just be that there is no real parliamentary strategy for this group. You know what I mean?
Well, you go ahead, Josh, and then I'll.
Yeah, I think I think it does kind of lean into the latter, right? Where it's kind of the lack of strategy, but it's more so because, I mean, and like you look at it, it's like it's not just that the squad's small; it's also really new.
Yeah.
They don't have the legislative clout or connections that can really help in the long run. I mean, I think I mean, it's nice that there's people in the Senate like Markey and whatnot who've kind of converted, as it were. But I think it's this slow process, and I think to be fair, we're even looking at kind of we're talking about this earlier, especially Tyler with Manchin and Cinema, like are they the establishment and whatnot? Because we were seeing that like they're kind of out of touch with what the majority wants, and like the majority does want certain objectives that we want. Not all of them, of course, but I think we are seeing a shift, at least as far as policy aspirations. It's just that we are in a really weird state right now, and it's I think activism is important as far as like encouraging leaders that the support's here for you to do this, or you need to do this, or X, Y, and Z will happen. We just don't. We're just not there yet, sadly.
Yeah, and I think to address the other part of your point in terms of a fear of the establishment, I think it's important to note that pretty much every member of the squad who got elected in 2018 had establishment challengers that they all stomped. I don't even think a single one of them got close. So in terms of like a fear of the establishment, I don't see why they would have it, because they're pretty much very solidly secured in all of their House districts as it currently stands.
Well, I think it might not so much be an electoral threat, but it might be that if I am just like, frankly, like I'm just an obstinate asshole on the floor of Congress, is anything that I actually want to get passed, is that going to make anything at all enticing for a member? Because there's other issues that they might want that might even be more small, like there might be some constituent services or
Right.
different things that you can get for your district that you jeopardize by doing that.
Yeah, and considering how transactional and how petty a lot of these appropriations can become in Congress, I can understand like not wanting to step on toes becomes a fact of life. And I guess that's probably the last point I could probably bring up about the Democratic side before maybe we talk about how Republicans in the establishment and state legislators are having issues with social issues, right? We can move to that next. I think the last question I have surrounding this is, what do you guys think about institutional creep being a threat for the squad? Do you think that it's already happened? Do you think it's not really something that's going to happen overtly, but it could be a limit of scope? Or is it, I mean, I'm tending to agree with Josh here at this point that because of how new it is and because of how, this hasn't exactly had precedent and this is a new moment we're in societally, right? That the strategy is not known.
Can you define institutional creeping, if you don't mind?
I guess it is the process of someone being considered part of the establishment at a point. You know what I mean? Where
Okay.
you spend enough time in Washington, you spend enough time in the military contracting towns
You
of
mean
Virginia.
more so kind of like going native, so to speak, where like they become part of the establishment,
Yeah.
not so much that they. Because I'm like, I mean, I think ideally the squad does become the establishment in the sense that it kind of conforms to them.
Right.
But I think you're more so talking about the opposite.
The opposite. We're more like the attitudes and the approach to respecting norms to the point of not doing anything. Like, is that a reality we should prep for?
I do not think so.
Okay.
And I think ultimately, I kind of have a checklist of things that I check off as to whether or not I consider someone's like actually a progressive candidate. And I'm not gonna go into the whole thing because I think it might get me canceled by a certain former presidential candidate's followers. But pretty much the top of that checklist is whether you are in a primary or a general election, you do not accept any type of special interest or corporate money, specifically from corporate like millionaires, billionaires. Because to me, that's how you become part of the establishment. I don't necessarily see it as these new young progressive candidates come in and they want to become part of this congealed like monolith that exists. I think what it is that people consider running. They are then approached by very rich people who say, you run, we will fund your election, we will funnel money into you, and then when you get here, you are just not going to do shit, and we are going to make sure that you keep looking good and you keep winning elections. To me, that is that process happens.
So in your case, you're defining the establishment as people who defend the class interests.
I do define the establishment as people who defend class interests. And I'm sure there's argument as to expanding or reducing that definition. But for me, I believe that the squad will be forever, well, progressives in general will be forever insulated from that kind of creep because they blanket deny those contributions and they are looking to remove those from the legal system.
I kind of I have a slight disagreement on the donor thing because I almost think of like it's a chicken and egg scenario where I think it's a lot of like so much them shopping for candidates who already agree with them because it's easier to just get fund someone who agrees with you than to bribe someone overtly. But I think my bigger concern with the squad honestly is them losing elections or not expanding the current state. I'm more concerned about that than I am about them kind of being co-opted, as it were.
Okay.
And we'll see. Well, it will remain to be seen what happens if either of these scenarios occur or not. But
I guess
that's my bigger fear.
Maybe just maybe a little bit of good news then is that I saw my wife recently was going through a random magazine for her job, and she actually saw Rashida Tlaib is listed as one of the most popular politicians in Detroit right now. And I think it is important that while the national conversation might be painting the squad as people who are not very well liked in their districts and the people who actually vote for them and decide if they stay in power, they do seem to be remaining.
They do seem to be popular in their districts, and I guess that's something. Yeah,
it's really interesting with her too because I think she was the one that was considered the most endangered, and she won pretty handedly and against like what would be considered by all accounts a very high quality challenger.
Did she times two? Was it a times two situation where Rashida got times two the votes?
It wasn't that close, but it was like it was in the double digits lead. Okay.
So yeah, I guess that's kind of a positive note in terms of the worry of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like that worried.
No, and honestly, you're right. Like, I feel like it is a little unrealistic to have the kinds of fears I was mentioning, especially considering.
It's fair, right? I mean, they're people. You know, naturally, you'd think that they could be corrupted in some way. I mean, it's I don't I think you look at some of the people who have been in Congress for a long time, and I'm sure that there was times where you probably thought their vote record actually looked pretty good compared to later on.
Yeah.
Well, and people are people. We should never. That's the thing. As much as I like the people who are in the squad, if they start slipping, like I will call it out and I will end my consistent contributions to them and what have you. I'm never gonna put people on a point, and I don't think progressives do that where they put people on a point where they just are devoid of criticism. I think that's something that the establishment kind of encourages. No offense to any. I don't know. That's super offensive.
I think you still see it in voters, and I think it's. I mean, we were talking about how that is like one of the things that like makes the establishment more attractive. In part too, because like frankly, when you have like that comfy, cozy feeling of having like a familiar name, there. I mean, even like when I'm doing congressional research, and it's like it's kind of nice saying like, oh hey, there's Biden 40 years ago.
Oh, you just went on mute.
It's just one of those things that like kind of it's you kind of like the familiarity, but I mean, not that it encourages me personally to like support someone over and over again, but I think that it's just something that people naturally are inclined to.
Continuity of government type thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's move to the other side of the aisle. So the book you brought up, what was the overall thesis?
Yeah, so it's I guess I'll just repeat the title. Red State Blues. It's actually by one of my mentors, Matt Grossman. The main thesis is basically that Republicans have had a ton of success in the state legislature, but there's a lot of their more government-oriented goals, like reducing the size of government and other substantial issues, and kind of deliberalizing government, that have kind of just fallen to the wayside because they've been really focused on certain social and cultural issues.
There's part of me that can't help but say, "Oh, boo-hoo for you!" Like, oh man, you sold out a bunch of minorities and like a whole gender, and now you can't make the government smaller.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, anecdotally, it makes sense when you think about it. Because anytime that like state government really kind of takes the reins as far as the national attention, it's almost always for some type of like social cultural bill, right? The bathroom bill back in 2015, I want to say.
Good God. Yeah.
I mean, the election bills. Genital inspections and stuff like that they're trying to pass in other places. Heck, with all the mask mandates and stuff like that.
Yeah, the mask issue. It became a culture war issue, and I guess that's the point. Because it was the right wing that started the culture war. They fired the first salvo, we can say, right?
Absolutely.
Well, and it's kind of funny too when you think about it, because what they're calling cancel culture now, it's like they've
that was the game back then. That was the game.
It's like, especially like Christians were heavy into censorship of certain things, right?
Yeah.
Harry Potter, Pokemon, they're all like the works of the devil, and they need to be canceled. They didn't use that term specifically, but
the mechanism and the phenomenon is particularly the same. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
real talk, I think Republicans are upset because Democrats are better at it.
Well,
so I will give them credit for one thing. They are much better at coming up with catchphrases, because cancel culture is
that rolls off the tongue too well.
It rolls off the tongue well. It sounds dangerous. Who's gonna be canceled next? Like, no one wants to be canceled.
But it's also like the lamest fucking thing to worry about. Like, I joke about being canceled, but like if you spend your days quivering in your boots that you're gonna get canceled, like, grow up.
You've probably done some fucked up shit.
You've
probably done something awful. Yeah, I guess that's kind of my point when I say that I feel like Democrats are bad at it. Is I feel like when you look at things that are like people are calling out that are worth being canceled over, Democrats are the ones who actually call out like real shit. Like, oh, you said the N-word on TV like several years ago.
Is it like always worth it? Because sometimes it just devolves into painting their opposition with the same internal culture war brush. Bernie Sanders is a white man, and it's like, and Hillary Clinton is what? But
true.
I mean, that it takes its own form in liberal circles where it's like,
I think that it's it's these more minute like episodes that like really allow them to paint it with this broad brush that I think people where it's like it is very much something that motivates people. I mean, if you call, if you actually believe all of the R drones on social media who, say like I was a lifelong Democrat until this woke thing happened. I mean, I don't trust that necessarily, but I think it's the one thing that really entices Republicans the most is the idea of the culture war.
Well, okay, so if I said Luke Combs, would you guys know who I'm talking about?
I need an explanation.
He's a country music artist. I've been told that he's apparently in like top 10 country music artists. Like he's a big deal in that scene. He actually just very recently said something to the effect of he took down all of his music videos that had the Confederate flag in it. And released a statement saying, like, I understand that this is not a part of my Southern heritage. This is, you know, a hate symbol that is actively damaging communities in this country, et cetera, et cetera. A surprisingly, like, very educated stance to take, and I would argue he did the right thing here. But I think, so, of course, Republicans have been losing their shit about it ever since it happened. And there are other people who are on the music videos with him that are calling him, like, the P word and, like, oh, he's a coward, like, blah, blah, blah. Another thing that comes to mind is the Aunt Jemima, the syrup bottles, where they got rid of an incredibly
Dr.
racist
Seuss getting canceled. Dear God.
Dr. Seuss. Well, no. So I'm framing these in a very specific way. The Dr. Seuss company deciding to pull certain books because of their really disgusting language and views towards people of other races. All three of those situations, those people were not canceled. These groups saw what they had. Were like, there were people, sure, writing letters to the Dr. Seuss Foundation and stuff, but they ultimately made the choice. No big bad boogeyman came down on them and demanded that they cut these things and remove them. And that's how Republicans frame cancel culture.
Well, isn't it interesting
like
in a sense that, like, you know, if you operate in market logic, you kind of have to make these appeal, even if you're trying to look at it cynically, that some of these decisions have to be made to appeal to a broader consumer base so that you don't alienate every possible customer, right? And I think it's funny because the pathology of it, right, is that they're coming for me. I did something wrong. I'm going to be judged. And you have companies preemptively making decisions to avoid judgment. They correctly, like, guess that, even if it's cynical. They correctly guess that if you assume market logic. But then they apply pathologically to themselves. And I think that's the id driving a lot of this right-wing side of the culture war. Is I don't want to be judged. I don't want to be called out. I would like to continue to enjoy and consume things without being questioned.
And I think it's difficult for us, like, not having that mindset to really comprehend just how salient this issue is for them.
Absolutely. And how much they obsess over things like this. Like, if we want to talk about one of these issues where it actually does start to hurt people, I think we can talk about the trans bathroom bills, but more specifically, like, the issue of trans athletes. I'm not saying this in a disparaging way, and I'm trying to say this in solidarity with trans people, right? But how many of us know a trans athlete, realistically speaking? These people making their days worrying about trans athletes.
Because the way I've seen, like, a few of my relatives post about this on social media,
right,
that are, more conservative, where they're like, like, oh, like, if a man, like, can't make it to, like, the varsity team, he's going to become a woman so he can be on the women's varsity team, and that's unfair to the women. And it's like, if it's just rooted in the very bizarre masculine,
it is such a pathological thing to worry about. It is such
like, it's rooted in this, like, really masculine idea of, like, oh, I need to be the best at what I do. And it's like, well, that inherently runs contrary to the idea that I'm willing to change my gender to participate in another sport.
Well, okay, and to me, one of the biggest fucking things here that just makes me, like, rage when we're discussing about these conversations is, like, bro, we're just talking about fucking high school sports. You know that thing that the education system's not supposed to be obsessed with? It's supposed to be obsessed with educating students. Like, don't get me wrong, sports are great, and, like, people should participate in them. But, Adi, we've talked about this before, how sometimes small-town culture is literally just the sports team, and that's, like, it.
And I think it's because it's not only lucrative for school administrators to have a successful, like, sports program, right? It also is, like, a route of, I mean, it is a career route for some people, I guess, right? Is, like, being an athlete becomes a way out of, like, certain things. And then because of the precarity of modern life, I think people, have these kind of pathological fears that then they project onto people who aren't the aggressor.
Well, and at the risk of getting into something that could probably be a total different podcast topic in and of itself, I will also say that I find it ironic that a lot of these communities that push for sports, because they have disinvested in so many other aspects of their education system, their community is dying as a whole. which is why the sports becomes the only way that you can get out. Not calling out any communities in specific.
Well,
but I
no,
think
but you know, but you can
talking
you can say this for like white communities in the South, particularly.
Yep.
You can definitely say that about that.
Well, it's kind of weird too, because like when you think about like a lot of school athletics, like I know, Tyler and I, we went to that same high school, but like you had to pay to be on like the football team and whatnot. Like,
And it was already a very well-funded school, from what I understand.
exactly. So it's like if you're like, it's kind of like one of those things where who cares? But for whatever reason, these things are deeply important to the Republican electorate. All these minor things, and to be fair, I mean, certain things like the Aunt Jemima thing, where people are like, how could you get rid of her? She's an institution in society. And it's like, well, even that decision, it was like, it wasn't like, I didn't see at least a lot of like people of color saying like, oh, Aunt Jemima needs to go. It's just like this thing to appear like they're more, woke.
They're with the times. They're with the times.
Yeah,
this company heard
it's
you.
Like, it's this weird superficial thing. And then they're like, oh, well, how could you do this? And it's like, because it's this bare minimum thing you can do to appear with the times. You don't have to,
you get to still make money selling watered down syrup. You still get to make your money doing it, but you get to look like you're with the times.
Nike Colin Kaepernick commercial.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that? How that got people burning their shoes.
Yeah, and he didn't even say anything about the flag or the kneeling in the commercial. He just showed up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just he's transcended like just being a person. He's just a symbol.
Yeah, he became a symbol of it. Much like how AOC is no longer an elected official, she is now a symbol in the culture war for people to get mad at or defend. Same thing with Kaepernick. Same thing with all of these people. And I think what the culture war has done effectively, I think when people talk about politics as a spectacle, it's not just the electoral processes and everything, period. Because the culture war itself is spectacle. Because it was started as like, we are literally, I mean, it started with the evangelical church, talking about this liberal affect as a force of Satan. It turns into a life and death conflict. It has become a life and death conflict. And it's to the point now where we've given up on any kind of electoral progress, but the culture war, we can milk that shit. We can make that happen.
You know what? I don't know how helpful just bringing up examples of the culture war is, but I do want to kind of talk about a very interesting situation that came up with my wife and I a couple years ago. So we are both practicing Lutherans. I sit on my church council. Like, we're very much like, we are Christians, and we are very proud of it, and we are happy with the way that we live. There was this movie that we went and saw called The Shack, and in The Shack, it is, quick synopsis, it's about a guy who meets God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit because he like gets hit by a truck or something, so he just gets a chance to meet them.
Novel approach, gotta say.
Yeah, interesting movie. I would recommend it just because I think it's quite dramatic. But anyway, God is played by a woman at the beginning of the movie, and even though
hashtag girl boss.
Well, so here's the thing. That movie ended up getting a lot of hate in Christian communities because they had God played as a woman. Regardless of the fact that in the actual fucking Bible, there are references to God being a feminine female figure. So
what was the line that like, I transcend form? I don't know my Bible, but like there's it's like, I transcend form, that you can't understand me.
There's references to God being motherly, and I mean like literally like as a female figure, not just, I transcend form and all that stuff as well. So what I think is hilarious is how you had this weird, like, you don't see a lot of the same team attacking each other in the culture war, but you basically had Christians v. Christians over this weird, like, why did you have God played by a woman kind of thing. And that's what I think
that's
it is.
Nothing new. It's all the way back to the Reformation, man.
Well, I don't know. My overall question is, why are you watching Christian movies, period? But
well, so here's my thing with the culture war as a whole, and specifically the role that religion plays in the culture war, considering that I am someone who is religious. I think a lot of people decide to take their political opinions and try to then justify it by saying that they are being a good Christian. My political opinion is that transgender people should not be allowed in sports. But I'm going to say that it is because Jesus told me that transgender people should not be in sports. Which is just complete fucking bullshit.
Yeah,
I'm a socialist, but I'm a Christian.
Yeah, and I think it's like it. I think very much religion and political views they're kind of co-developed at the same time, and it's how you're introduced to the religion, right? How, like, what was your pastor telling you, especially as a kid, because I know you more recently came into Lutheranism and whatnot.
Yes.
Which might influence your own take on it, but if you're brought up around that stuff, and it depends on how that lens is done. And we're talking about the perception of God and whatnot, and it's very much like a political thing too, where perception trumps reality in a lot of ways, right? And it's very much rooted in how Republicans and Republican officials talk to their constituents, right? There's that kind of infamous example from, I think, the RNC in 2016, where Paul Ryan says the economy feels stuck. It doesn't matter if it is stuck or not. It's just that it feels kind of not good.
Oh yeah, and I'm just gonna say that, like, right-wing ideology and, like, their whole stance in the culture war is buried so heavily in their interpretation of Christianity, and, like, they claim that Christianity's backing so many of these beliefs, that one of the best ways that I have found to trigger right-wingers, my fucking Twitter handle is Christian Socialist, and they lose their shit. Any type of Twitter discussion or debate that I get in right-wing people, it is maybe two things in where they're like, oh, you say you're a Christian, but you're a socialist? Like, that can't work. Like, that isn't real. And it's like, just so interesting to see how that's kind of been hijacked. That's maybe this would be an interesting podcast topic again. I feel like I come up with those, like I've been coming up with a lot of those. But,
I've been taking notes. Don't worry about it.
Just the way that Christianity has kind of been hijacked by the right wing, and how there are very much like Christian Democrats that exist. Joe Biden is an example, as much as I don't agree with him on a vast majority of things. We do exist, and we just don't get to really talk a ton. Like, the culture war has very much been framed in a way that if you are Christian, you're just expected to be supporting the right wingers.
Well, and there's a lot of stuff like that too. Like, I know, if people have, like, the American flag out on their, like, doorstep and whatnot, a lot of people tend to think, oh, it's probably a Republican neighborhood and whatnot. Let's,
yes,
wash our toes. But, like, that's not necessarily true.
But
And in fact, I think the statistics show that it's very unpredictable of someone's political views.
Yeah, I think we've all just braced ourselves for cultural signaling over, like, any other kind of questioning or engagement with people, because, like, that's just so indicative of our society. Everyone's wearing their heart on their sleeves and their Trumps on their hats.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting too, like, where we're talking about this religious framework within the cultural war and whatnot. And I think the culture wars really made persuasion difficult, right? You're a Christian socialist, but you're not, and you have, you're able to link these views seamlessly, right? And you're able to point, oh, like, this connects to this and whatnot. But that doesn't persuade them to come in line with you or not.
Just makes them think I'm going to hell. I mean, that's literally it. Is like, people don't stop.
When, as you said, right, it's more about, I mean, not necessarily that you're about triggering them, but that's what it does more than it does like oh, like,
I do
how
it
can
as
this guy be a Christian socialist?
I do it for a couple reasons personally. Like, yes, there's the triggering them factor, but it is also the fact that, like, I am proud to be what I am, and I want people to be aware that people like me do exist. I don't know. That gets into a whole weird identity thing, so tangent for another day. But...
Well, that's why this is part 2 of Piss. Power, identity, and social structures.
I did it. I tied it back. Perfect.
There you go.
Oh, God bless it.
Yeah, I think ultimately what I can conclude with is the establishment as a term is kind of a useful bit of terminology to understand how power flows in institutions like political parties, but it has an obscuring effect. And And then the culture war is the opposite, but it does the same kind of obscuring. So I'm really not sure. This is a dilemma of human communication at this point. How do you explain the depth of complex ideas you hold and the complex networks of information to describe political processes without just making someone fall fucking asleep? It's tough.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting too to note that, like, you've, as much as we were talking about, these connections between the establishment and the culture war, how much that they are, it's kind of the way that you tell the two parties establishments apart, right? Is
Right.
the culture war is really the crux of division between the Republicans and Democrats at that, like, establishment level, because at the establishment level, when it comes to fiscal things, there's all kinds of symmetries, especially like on foreign policy too, right?
Right. Right.
With the most recent, to kind of stay, relevant, is stuff like Israeli Palestine, right? Well,
Yeah.
the establishment position is naturally, like, it's firmly
Everyone's at APAC.
pro-Israel.
They're all at APAC. They're sitting in the same booth.
Yeah, and it's not nearly the partisan issue that the right usually tries to make it out to be, and that's true of a lot of things too. Foreign policy, I mean, it comes to military funding and whatnot. All of these things are very much kind of, they're like the one thing that unites that establishment level of the parties. But the culture war is the one thing where they, and maybe they've mastered this for like electoral purposes, right? Like, this is how I differentiate myself from my opponent, is I think that you are a person or not based on, your identity.
Yeah. And I guess maybe then in a weird way that is technically they're some type of a centrist. Like I said earlier, how I'm trying not to use the term centrist when it comes to the establishment, because I don't feel like they're actually in the center anymore. But I guess when you've got, like, those are your two options, I guess arguably that's kind of centrist in that, like, fiscally or in a couple of issues you agree handedly.
Yeah, I mean, not to borrow QAnon terminology, but the cabal, as they like to call it, right? Whether you adopt the conspiratorial mindset or whether you just try to look at it objectively, like, there are people and people within institutions who fundamentally want to maintain a status quo. And I think that's what gets lost, and maybe let's try to end with discussing that, is the establishment seems united on those things you've mentioned, on how capitalism, particularly the neoliberal mode of it, continues to operate. They're both invested in that, both establishments of either party, on foreign policy, on whether or not we get to pull out of Iraq or not. That, everyone's kind of on the same boat about that kind of thing. And I guess that really is what we need to overcome at an individual level, or even at a movement level, is trying to transcend the culture war has been the most difficult part of this.
Well,
Yeah.
and oh, sorry, go ahead.
And I was going to kind of mention too that, kind of on the opposite end of the non-establishment end, we've seen that there's issues that unite ultra conservatives and ultra liberals.
Mm-hmm.
There's been, I think, the GameStop stock issue, right? There was the big thing where AOC had like tweeted out something about that, and like Ted Cruz said, I agree, and like, wow, Ted Cruz and AOC. But then her response came, or basically like, I don't want to work with someone who tried to get me killed. And it's very much that, like, this culture war issue and whatnot has kind of, it's made that, like, building those cross-aisle coalitions for even issues that we care about almost impossible, because they're just too different to work.
Yeah, and it's almost the only conflict that seems to matter to people anymore, is like, we foregone the idea of pushing back against the establishment and saying, okay, we don't agree with your vision for the world and how to run an economy or how to conduct foreign policy.
I think it's kind of interesting to note, and it's kind of, I'm not going to put on a tinfoil hat, but it's kind of sinister when you think about it, how the establishment of both parties have basically made sure that the culture war is fighting about things that will never affect them personally. Like, we do not have any transgender House reps or senators, from what I am aware. I know there was a candidate in West Michigan who attempted, but I don't believe they won. So whether or not transgender people are allowed in sports doesn't matter to them. Whether or not like pick X culture war issue here thing here, it's not going to affect them. What will affect them is the people who donate to them being inconvenienced by a tax increase, by ending or defunding the military, by like these things that like you'll notice that they're still hit on by people who are offshoots from the establishment, but they're basically just never brought up if you're in the establishment.
Yeah, and it's a ultimately obscuring effect is that we never get to address the root cause of how exploitative the modern system is, how broke people are, how much debt people are fucking in. It'll never come to the fucking table.
Not currently, anyway. I argue, given time and given progressives specifically having the ability to continue like growing their coalition, I believe that those things are going to be addressed. It's going to take time, but I believe it is very possible.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, we're talking about, like these things that aren't on the table, and it's like partly because they're not being proposed by generally people in the establishment, right? Like,
Yeah.
who knows what Nancy Pelosi thinks on anything, right? Like, is there anything that you can identify that like this is an issue that she was she was spearheading it, right? She was introducing it, or even McConnell. I mean, I guess with him you could say judges.
Well, McConnell at least has a project, and I think that's another thing to note too is you've mentioned that very effectively the DLC has a project which is try to win as many elections as we can and keep the same people in power as long as we can. But it's a project to an end. Getting elected is a project to an end. We still don't know what the vision is, and if you want to get cynical, you could say there is none. But with the Republicans, particularly Mitch McConnell's project that he's really doing well on, and it's worrisome that he's doing this well, is just packing every fucking court in the country with Heritage Foundation psychos. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line of it is that one of these groups has a clear vision. It's a shitty one, but they're doing a job. And then there's one that it has succeeded in keeping a strong hold over itself, but is doing nothing with it. It's like you've kept a skyscraper intact in an earthquake, but no one is safely in there. It's not accomplishing anything. It just exists.
And again, like I've mentioned before, how long a lot of these people have been there, and it's like a lot of the vast majority of the progressive issues that we're talking about today are identical to the ones we were talking about in 2009, and identical to the ones we were talking about before that too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just so little progress, and I think that's what really frustrates people.
Absolutely.
Well, political cartoons, are not something to be taken as like, perfect, but I will say that they do provide some very interesting insight. And one of them that I saw was basically the first panel was like America in the 1980s. And it's like two people who are like, oh my goodness, a third person has agreed to join our socialist club. Like, this is so exciting. Like, we're going to do so much better. And then it flicks to like 100 people are together who are like, oh, our social in 2020. And they're like, our socialist candidate for president didn't win. Oh, this is awful. And it's basically just where we're at in terms of the socialist leftist movement over the past couple decades, where we are basically in the best time insofar in American history that socialists and leftists have had. So like, this is the time, if we're going to get progress, to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think, it shows that, 2020 especially shows that, we need to capitalize on momentum, because I think 2020 also demonstrated that there's not quite enough of us yet, but it's growing. And because, say what you will about how that primary was handled and if, Sanders was robbed and whatnot, the fact of the matter is he just did not have enough support to get the way through unless it was divided between 20 plus candidates.
I agree with that assessment, because the way the Bernie theory of change operates is we're going to get in enough people outside the system so aren't registered voters. We're going to get first-time voters to come and put themselves behind Bernie. And for what it's worth, yes, they were able to pull a lot of people. But it seems that the situation is so dire that most people choose non-participation over engagement, because they've correctly, or at least like have a reasonable reason. Oh my god, reasonable reasons. They've reasonably concluded that there's too much risk and not enough reward in getting engaged, even at the level of just voting. So in that sense, like we do have to accept the failure that like getting people to participate in an election is still a bit of a stretch because that's how out of faith people are.
Yeah, and you're kind of talking about the investment, even in just voting. I think, we kind of underestimate the emotional investment involved with elections, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen the tears shed on election night.
Right.
Maybe we've shed a few ourselves. Um, and I think it's like a curse of being this invested and whatnot, that when outcomes are so contrary to what you want, it's deeply frustrating and takes a toll on your mental health.
Well, and this is where I believe the beautiful relationship between activism and elections comes in. Because you take a movement such as BLM, you take an organizer in that movement such as Cory Bush, and then that movement is able to pull in enough people and is able to get out and get enough force behind them that they are able to topple an established Democrat like Lacey Clay. And this is where I think I wouldn't say that that's obviously not the only purpose of activism, but that's one of the great ways that activism can kind of lead into elections, in the sense that they create engagement that then translates in the November of each year, right?
Yeah, and there's another book I've been reading called Whip by a former representative, actually from Michigan, David Bonnier, who was a former Democratic whip. He was definitely on the more progressive side. I think even like Sanders' review of the book refers to him as like a mentor when he was in Congress. And he talks very like one of the sections of the book is very much about how, and he was I think he was defeated, or he was redistricted in like 2004 or something like that. So he left. It was actually the district that became Candace Miller's district.
Okay.
For context. But he talks about how important like that movement, like building and sustaining the movement is, and kind of, he talks a little bit about, because he was there as, the DLC was kind of preempting things, and he was the one Democratic leader that kind of held out on endorsing Clinton until it was absolutely clear that this is our new leader. And every time he kept pressing him on like, so what, NAFTA, what are you going to do about it? And he's like, well, he was at least honest with me, but I didn't like his answer. But it's very much talking about how important sustaining your movement is and nurturing it. And we need to keep doing that if we have any aspirations of achieving any of our objectives.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those fights that we have to accept we're in this for the long haul.
Yes.
I'm pulling off of an anecdote here, and I don't even have the details, but from what I recall about it is that in a certain, I think it was Honey Baked Ham or something, I forget if that was the company involved, but they had to try for 26 years to unionize because that's how stacked the deck is. And I think what our discussion yielded today, I think it was productive, is that these are the institutional forces we're up against. The twin ones of the establishment as it exists and the culture war as an obscuring force, right? And just accepting that, like, yes, the deck is against you is useful in trying to assess how much emotional worth we need to put into this. Because, yes, if we were committed to, restructuring our society in a more equitable way, if we're trying to fight climate change and all of this stuff, we're going to have to accept that, like, certain routes of engagement are not going to yield effective results on the first try. That's just the nature of the fight.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep, totally agree. And I mean, and to be fair, it's it's kind of worth noting that a lot of the work has been done for us by future generations, right? And as frustrating as it is that in a lot of ways our aspirations are kind of restoring, mistreated institutions, we still have clear goals to aspire to and or surpass in certain cases. So a lot of the work has been done for us. It's really just about mobilization.
Yeah, I think the questions all remain the same. It's not that we have to reinvent the wheel, it's just to keep it turning.
But hey, we got it. Someday we'll all be old people and be like, hey, this is great. Everything's great now.
Then we'll be the out of touch one.
Then the Gen Alpha will have a whole new set of things that they're like, what? So,
well, thanks again, guys, for coming on. This has been a really good discussion, and I really think this, helped me contextualize the current moment a little better too. Anything you guys want to plug or share, or if you want people to follow you on social media, do you want to drop your handles?
Go ahead, Josh.
Sure, I guess I'll drop my handle. I'll probably be working on a website soon. So I'm at Joshua Koss 17. Koss is Koss. I'm a PhD student working on institutions. So, that's presumably why I was brought in for this discussion.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so I'm working on quite a bit of research right now. My main project right now is on congressional retirement. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of lack thereof today, but people do eventually leave.
It's so noteworthy when it happens. It is a body of study. It is.
Yes. Unfortunately, that might be a little
well,
dark.
you worked on when Dingle retired. Like, you were involved in that archive.
I was when Rogers retired.
Oh, Rogers,
Dingle,
my bad.
His collection was at U of M, and I have no idea if they're going to ever release that stuff because there was boxes and boxes and boxes, from what I understand.
Probably some CIA material in there too. So
I did. There was actually it was Bonnier. Now that I think about it, I went through his stuff. No, it wasn't. Was it Bonnier? No, it was a senator from Michigan. I went through his stuff, and there was actually a noteworthy letter that someone had sent him from a member of the John Burke Society.
Oh, wow.
Which, we could that's probably a subject on right-wing activism over the years, right?
Remind me to get you on for another episode.
For sure, but there was a letter from there that someone was saying oh, I disagree with you and I'm part of this, and he forwarded the letter to J. Edgar Hoover, who was oh, thank you for letting us know that you're part of the John Burke Society. Basically, we'll be keeping an eye on you in the future.
Oh gosh.
So just the QAnon folks charging the Capitol, exposing their identities, it's nothing new.
Absolutely. All right, Tyler, anything you got for us?
Well, so if you're interested in supporting Christian socialists and you enjoy candles, my wife and I do have a candle company called Fox Family Flames. Our website is www.foxfamilyflames.com. If you want to purchase your candles through us, we just launched our summer line, actually, as the weather is getting nicer. So please feel free to check that out if you have the time. We are also on Facebook and Instagram with the same name, at Fox Family Flames.
Well, that's our time. Thanks again, listeners, for tuning in. I'll have the links to our social media in the description. Until then, take care.
I wish I had 9 lives.